This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
But being confronted with what it is to lead and govern and shepherd a flock of Christ was, it just overwhelmed me. And it made me have deep wrestlings with God. And God used it. I mean, there was a period of time there in which I wanted to get as far away from the Christian ministry as I could. But God used it to help make me face some things, deal with some things in my own heart, and it turned out to be a great blessing and privilege.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. My name is Jonathan Master, and I'm joined, as always, by my friend and co-host, James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm doing very well. I'm looking forward to this, the first of two episodes that we're recording with our guest, and we could use more because we're covering literally what may be the biggest single work we've ever talked about in Theology on the Go, a 3-volume work of pastoral theology, authored by Albert N. Martin, and we are talking with David Chanski today, a good friend of mine, and Pastor Martin's successor at Trinity Baptist Church in Montville, New Jersey, about this really wonderful work on pastoral theology. So I'm excited to be here, looking forward to our conversation, and somewhat daunting at the task of thinking through these 3 volumes, but we'll think about selections out of them together with Pastor Chanski.
Yeah, we should say at the outset, this is, as James mentioned, this is a 3-volume pastoral theology. It's one that we would commend to our listeners, particularly pastors. It's meant for pastors or men who are training to be pastors. To those groups at least, we would commend this very highly. It's going to be impossible for us to cover every aspect of this 3-volume work, but there is no one who can better guide us through this than David Chanski. James mentioned he is the pastor of Trinity Baptist Church in Montville, New Jersey, successor to Pastor Al Martin. And so, Dave, thanks for joining us today.
I'm very glad to be here, and thanks so much for inviting me.
I want to start with giving our listeners a little bit of the background. This is a 3-volume work now, but it didn't start out as a 3-volume work. So can you provide us a little bit of a background on the lectures that form the basis for this big set of books?
Yes, by all means. It really didn't start out as something that was intended to be turned into book form. It was just intended to be lectures on pastoral theology. Back in the late 1970s, there were a number of young men at Trinity Baptist Church in northern New Jersey here. Now it's in Montville. Then it was Caldwell. It was Essex Fells, I think it was known as. But back in the late 70s, a number of young men wanted to be in the ministry, and the pastors wanted to see some of these men ultimately in the ministry. And they felt like the choices were basically Westminster Seminary back then, or they do something themselves. And that's what they ended up doing. They had a desire to mentor and train men. And so it ultimately started out, I believe, with Saturday morning theology classes, but then eventually morphed into what became known as Trinity Ministerial Academy. And that ran from, like I said, the late 70s until either 1999 or 2000. And in that setting, Pastor Martin was not the main teacher per se. They had hired some men just to teach, and some other pastors did teaching, but he taught pastoral theology. And so it was at first, I think, a 2 or 3 year program. When I came, it had just turned into a 4-year program, but he lectured to every class every year. All the classes sat in together, so you eventually got all 3 or 4 semesters in. But he probably went through these lectures in live teaching in the academy 7 or 8 times by the time the academy closed in 2000. And over those years, the tapes, the cassette tapes would go out and people would listen to them, people like Bill Shishko, of course. And many of those men desired that these things would be put into print someday. And as I mentioned before we were on air, I was one of the ones who urged Pastor Martin to do that. I did it by writing. I think I still have a copy of that letter in a file somewhere. But number one, he was mainly a pastor and a preacher, and that's what he said. And then also there was another thing that he would frequently say. We would hear it during the lectures in the academy. I don't have any desire to embalm these lectures in printer's ink. In other words, what he meant by that was, I'm constantly learning. And whenever he came to do a lecture, even if he had done it a half dozen times before, he would spend a couple hours on it the day before and that morning, changing things. Sometimes he would redo his whole outline for the lecture because he came to see it differently, or he read something that made him think differently. And so eventually, though, after he left the ministry here and moved to Michigan based on various providences and circumstances in his life, what he said he never wanted to be, and that is a writer, because he thought he was a preacher. He eventually, through circumstances and the persuasive efforts of some of his his colleagues in the ministry over the years, he took to writing with some real help from a number of people, especially one man who was a pastor here in northern New Jersey named John Ruther. And this came to be, and I'm thrilled about that reality.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jonathan.
No, jump in.
I should say, long before this became embalmed in printer's ink, the tapes or different versions of the tapes themselves had circulated for many years, and many people who unlike you, never attended Trinity Ministerial Academy in person did end up hearing these tapes. And many of us who went to, a kind of 3 or 4 year brick and mortar Master of Divinity type seminary ended up using these audio recordings as remediation or expansion for the pastoral theology that we would have gotten in seminary. For most of us, pastoral theology may have been 1 or at most 2 semesters in which everything was sort of shoehorned into 15 weeks or something like that, whereas Pastor Martin in the end ends up developing basically a 4-year curriculum. Yes. In which it's not all just him. He's really curating. This is how I think of much of his work. He's curating so much of the best of the Protestant and Reformed tradition on pastoral theology. And so you'll hear in these pages, as in his lectures, you hear from Anglicans like Charles Bridges or Presbyterians like Thomas Murphy, or J.W. Alexander of Old Princeton on preaching. And so Pastor Martin really was just a student of the Protestant Reformed tradition on preaching and pastoring, and brought this highly well-researched and curated selection and then put it together with his own anecdotes and experience and biblical study. And I wanted to be careful and say this for many of us, long before it was in print, was a form of remediation. I don't want to say correction necessarily, because I don't want to undermine the value of good teaching that many of us did receive in the seminaries we went to. But there was just frankly nothing out there remotely like the volume, the texture, the density, the expansiveness as what these lectures offered. So for some of us, like you, I'm sure, David, to see them in print and embalmed, as Pastor Martin always dreaded they would be, but they did become, really is a thrilling thing to think this is now, we can now just sit down, slow down with it, look at those big, long, juicy quotes on the page for ourselves. It's really, really delightful.
Right. Yes. And I think it was Jonathan who said something about me being the person who would, be best to speak about this. I mean, I don't want to say that I am an expert on anything, but humanly speaking, probably he's correct on that, in part because I did sit through the lectures, and they had a great impact on me, so much so that when I moved to Minneapolis, that was the first place I pastored after the academy, I had the church there pay for the 220 or whatever it was cassette tapes that were available at the time so that I could listen to them. And over the course of, I don't know, a dozen years or so, I listened through those things twice, just when I was on my exercise machine or driving in my car. And then when I came back here in 2008, Pastor Martin was finishing up some of the what they called Pastoral Theology modules, which were kind of like the run-up to the effort with the book. And then I've sat through a number of those. And then for volumes 2 and 3 of these things, I did the final read and edit. So that was a thrill just to do that. It made me realize how wonderful these things were, how valuable they would be, in part because I'm not the kind of a person who, if I'm going to prepare a sermon or want to look up something and read on a subject, I don't immediately go to try to find something on audio and then listen to it. I like to have a book, and I like to read the book and highlight the book and be able to turn back to it and put it back on my shelf and look at the index, etc. So I really, really am thrilled. I mean, that's probably the best word for it, to say that we have these volumes now.
David, I want to have you walk us through and give kind of a synopsis of the topics that are covered. But before we even get to that, there are these 3 volumes, but you mentioned that they are originally lectures, and men would be sitting through these lectures all together, which yes, I suppose means that some guys would be starting at different points and then eventually in their 4 years would be cycling through it. How significant is it in these, do you think, to start at the beginning? I mean, there's a logic to it. Volume 1 is the man of God, his calling and godly life. Then it's the man of God, his preaching and teaching labors. And then finally, it's the man of God in his shepherding, evangelizing, and counseling labors. So that makes sense. But I'm imagining that initially, at least, you might be jumping in the equivalent of volume 2 and then ending in volume 1. Is that correct? And I guess then in terms of today's reader or pastor, how significant is it to kind of read these in succession, or do you think that you can sort of dip your toe in at different places?
Well, a very good question. I'll just give a couple of personal anecdotes that will help to answer it. In recent years, I have, with my book allowance, purchased a handful of these books at a time, and I keep them on my shelf. And then when I meet up with men who are ministerial aspirants, I will often ask them, once I get to know them a little bit and think that they have a good reason for their aspirations, I'll ask them if they have any of these volumes. And if they don't, then I always give them volume 1, because it's on the call to the ministry, especially because I want them to be able to read that stuff and work through it. Now, there's a sense in which back during the days of the Trinity Ministerial Academy, a man has gone through at least a good part of that process, the beginning part of that process. He doesn't just end up at Trinity Ministerial Academy because he applied. He's vetted before he comes. So I've ended up coming in at the equivalent of what became volume 3, the shepherding aspect. But I had gone through, based on my home church's knowledge of me and calling me even to go study in a seminary, and then the men here interviewing me and inviting me, I knew about the call and so on. But I would say anyone who's not in the ministry should definitely start with a call. Some men who are in the ministry who really want to think through what was the right way to be called, because maybe they weren't, should start there. But I think volume 2, preaching, a minister could start there. If that's what he senses is his great need, he could start at volume 3 on shepherding. I began at what was volume 3, what became volume 3 in my first year. And then he hadn't advanced it to 4 full semesters by the time I came to my 4th year. So I heard that twice. It was all good and helpful for me. And in fact, it was providential for my benefit that I came in under that section of the lectures, because I did kind of look at preaching as the main thing the ministry is about. I would say it's a main thing, but being confronted with what it is to lead and govern and shepherd a flock of Christ was, it just overwhelmed me. And it made me have deep wrestlings with God, and God used it. I mean, there was a period of time there in which I wanted to get as far away from the Christian ministry as I could. But God used it to help make me face some things, deal with some things in my own heart, and it turned out to be a great blessing and privilege.
David, let's talk about volume 1 just for a moment, because as you said, about half of it is on the call, and then the other half is really on the character, the spiritual formation and character of the man of God. Why so much time on the call? I mean, lots of pastoral theology books tend to go kind of pass over that very quickly and go to more practical hints and helps, that kind of thing. Why is it necessary to spend such a great deal of time on discerning the call? And what, maybe I can add to that, what sort of blessings will come from that prolonged consideration? And then also maybe what pitfalls could be avoided if one will take the time? And then kind of in your answer, if you could just say, what are a couple of the key features of the call that Pastor Martin unpacks?
Yeah. So I think it's important to spend that kind of time on the call just because the topic itself is so important. They have great implications for the church, and I mean the individual church and the church at large, if you will. Great implications for the advancement of the gospel and the advancement of Christ's kingdom in the world. It's that important a thing. And then it's also important because there is so much fuzzy thinking on this subject out there, and we could say, better maybe would be to say it, foolish thinking, unbiblical thinking on the subject. In other words, I think one of the errors, I mean, Pastor Martin goes through in the volumes, several errors. One of them, maybe the biggest that I've ever confronted, is that it's just, the call to the ministry is just an inward and individual thing. In other words, I have a sense. In fact, even when we come to the subject of whether women should be gospel ministers, you'll come across women who say, well, I know that God has called me. So even beyond that, though, people have this perspective that no one else can tell me whether God has called me. And I was in a setting like that in Bible college, and I became very frustrated with it even before I ever knew anything about the Reformed faith or, Reformed churches, etc. That's a very dangerous thing. And then going along with that, people think, well, we don't need the involvement of the church in this because it's an individual thing. I can remember sitting in a seminary that was a lobby that was associated with the Bible college I mentioned, and hear a guy saying, to some of his fellow students, he's about why he needs to get into the preaching ministry. He says, because I'm like Jeremiah, I have this burning in my bones, that if I don't preach, it will be woe unto me. Well, those are the kinds of problems that exist in people's thinking. And I think most significantly for an individual, you mentioned some of the pitfalls. What are possible pitfalls? I think most significantly for an individual, it's the danger of running without being sent by God, like Jeremiah warns about, Jeremiah 23. But also for the church, a church could suffer because of they put a man in the ministry who's not biblically called and identified by the church, by his pastors, by mature Christians who know. A man's family could suffer harm and neglect because he's bitten off something he really can't chew. He's in way over his head, and his family, his children could end up resenting the gospel, resenting the Church of Christ, resenting God because of what they see that the Christian ministry has done to their dad or themselves or their family.
That's helpful. When I was in college in the 90s, there was a biology professor at my college who told me one time that Albert Martin saved him from a great life of pain. And I said, "Well, you knew Albert Martin?" He said, "No, I don't." I said, "Well, how did he save you from a great life of pain?" And he said, "I listened to his cassette tapes on the call to the ministry, and it helped me discern that I wasn't called." This is a man who was a biology teacher, led a home Bible study, very good at it, godly man. He said, and I discerned that what I thought was the call wasn't the call, and I pursued my doctorate in science, and now I'm a biology professor and am a much happier Christian as a result. And so it was just a testimony of the early cassettes of Pastor Martin on the call sent this man into a life of biology instead of pastoral ministry, and he was grateful many years in reflection on that.
Yeah, and I've heard many similar stories, and I agree with you that they were spared. Those men were spared by the mercy of God.
This could potentially kill book sales, though, for volumes 2 and 3, if people get halfway through one.
I'm gonna have to look into that.
I'm not that man. So I mean, I didn't want to hurt the sale. So here's what I would recommend: just buy all 3 volumes at once.
There you go.
Even if halfway through volume 1 you discern maybe. But I think it's also good, even for lay people, to have a sense of what it means for their pastor to be the man of God who is called. So I really think there's benefit there as well. Let's talk just briefly, and we're kind of wrapping up our first episode together, and we have a second one we hope to do in future. For the second half of volume 1, Pastor Martin talks about the character of the man of God. I want to read a quote of his. This is from the first volume, page 227, and he provides an axiom. Those who are not familiar with Pastor Martin's teaching style or his writing style will not be able yet to appreciate how vital these axioms are, how they are these weight-bearing propositions that then can be unfolded in so many pages. But here's the axiom I'm interested in. He says, a sustained effectiveness in pastoral ministry will generally be realized in direct proportion to the health and vigor of the redeemed humanity of the man of God. Now, he spends many pages unpacking the very terms of that axiom. But what if we could get a shortened version of it? What exactly does he mean? Why does he spend so much time on the kind of man he is in the second half of volume 1?
Well, so that phrase, redeemed humanity, one of Pastor Martin's favorite phrases, and I would hear it in the academy and in the lectures. I would hear it from the pulpit when I was in the church here, or if I've listened to his preaching. He would speak about the entirety of our redeemed humanity. And he would be referring to passages like 1 Corinthians 6 or Romans 8:23, which Romans 8:23 talks about we're waiting for our adoption, the redemption of our bodies. In other words, the resurrection. And the point he would make is Christ didn't just redeem our souls, he redeemed our bodies as well. And so his point there is that that God has redeemed us body and soul. And so he addresses in that section, when he speaks about our redeemed humanity, he addresses the man of God's spiritual life, but he also addresses, as you'll recall, his physical and emotional life, and then he will address his relationship to the people of God, his relationships to the members of his own family, and so on. And the axiom then means that a faithful preacher is going to attend to every aspect of his life, every aspect of his redeemed humanity. And the point then is that we should expect God to bless his faithful efforts. There's a place in there where he quotes Charles Spurgeon, and Spurgeon says about that, he says, we are in a certain sense our own tools, and therefore we must keep ourselves in order. And that just makes me think of one of the passages that I always associate with our pastoral theology lectures. I'll just quote part of it. Take heed to yourself, for in doing this, you will save both yourself and those who hear you. So in other words, as many of the old writers will say, that it's the man who is the ministry. And you can think of many quotes yourself. I can't pull any up right now, but I think of parts of Dabney where he mentions this. I can think of McShane, where he says that a holy minister is an awful weapon in the hands of God, or something like that. So I think that's getting at what you're talking about there, James.
I think it's fair to say, I think there might be a modern suspicion that this is tending towards some kind of self-righteousness or sense of self-importance, or an almost a phony and a pretended piety. And I would say emphatically not what's being taught here. I wanted to read a quote that Pastor Martin includes from Thomas Shepard, one of the great 19th century sources that he goes to again and again with profit. Murphy says of the man of God, he is to be a leader in the spiritual host of God. Must he not go before others in spiritual attainments? He goes on a little further, to draw men up to a more and more elevated standard of piety and devotedness is the appointment he holds from the great head of the church. Surely he must himself rise still higher. I wanted to just as we kind of wrap our thoughts on volume 1, and before we enter in to contemplation of the other 2 larger volumes, is it necessary that the man of God have, in Murphy's words, gone before others in attainments, understanding that every man of God who stands in the pulpit, this side of heaven, of course, is sinful, and will and does commit sin because he's not completely free of it. But is it important that he have achieved a higher standard? And I guess what I'm thinking of is the contemporary tendency of some ministers to so want to identify with the average or the mean of the spiritual attainment of their congregation, that in a sense they almost preach themselves down to the average, and so they'll include themselves almost by design, include their own non-attainments as a regular part of their ministry to sort of console their people for themselves not having attained. And I get a different vibe, so to speak, reading this statement from Thomas Murphy. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. Murphy, I think, when he uses the word attainments, he's not saying that a man has become such an eloquent preacher that he's noted for it, or he's not, gathered a megachurch around himself by his preaching. But he means, of course, spiritual attainments, in other words, his godliness. And so Pastor Martin uses the word, when he speaks about the ministerial qualifications, he uses the word exemplary. He doesn't say that a man has to have, he has to be the most spiritually advanced or spiritually mature man in the congregation in order to be a pastor of that congregation. But he has to be exemplary, and that fits in with Paul's statement, like he says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. And you could take many other passages. I would use 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, the passages that give the qualifications. We were not taught that we have to be the best in the congregation. A man might be the godliest man in the congregation if he's the pastor, but there might be men in the congregation and women in the congregation that excel him in some areas of the spiritual life. So that's an important thing. And he also makes the point that God can use, and God has used, men who are less than exemplary in the ministry, some far less. He made the point at some point in his lectures there that God has used greatly some men who populate hell right now. In other words, they could be lost, like Judas. I believe Judas may well have preached, and some people may have been converted through his preaching when he went out with the 12 and with the 70. Undoubtedly, he worked miracles. but he ended up being lost, so that he could not say in the end, just like many people cannot say, well, but we prophesied in your name, or we worked miracles in your name. And I think, as you asked, that it does confront people in our generation who are trying to just emphasize that they're just part of the crowd, and don't think too highly of me. And none of us should want anyone to think too highly of ourselves. If we know ourselves at all, we can't do that. But I know what you're talking about, and I think there is this modern inclination to dumb down the qualifications for the ministry, because number one, it can help to open the door to many more prospective gospel ministers. And also it can take pressure off of men to live up to a more biblical standard. But neither of those things is really a good thing, is it?
That's right.
Not from a biblical perspective, anyway.
Well, I want to say, I think Volume 1 really gives a lot of great counsel. It doesn't just say that you should be holy, but it really also gives a lot of practical counsel on how to, day in and day out, cultivate that humility and Christ-likeness.
Amen.
James, this was just the beginning of a longer conversation about some really valuable works of pastoral theology. You had, it sounds like, listened to most, if not all, of these lectures. I'd listened to some of them and then benefited greatly from the books. But it's just remarkable to think about the extent to which Pastor Martin thought through all these issues. And one of the things that comes through is just how carefully he researched and reflected on some of these topics that are often treated in a very perfunctory fashion.
He was a careful listener and widely read and a real student of preaching, not just contemporary, but even older preaching and teaching about preaching. I think the importance of these volumes, I'm looking forward to our forthcoming conversations as we continue discussing with Pastor Chanski, but the importance of these volumes, I would want to say, can't really be overestimated. This is not overstated. This is not the kind of thing where a man sits down and says, 24 months later, I'm going to have my pastoral theology book off to the publisher. This is really the result of several decades of primarily teaching this, not with a view toward publication, but toward really helping those training for the ministry or already in the ministry. And as I mentioned, these lectures had a life of their own in various audio forms before they ever became the 3-volume book form that we now have. But I also would want to say they are arguably peerless in the sense that contemporary works on pastoral theology, I can't think of one that would be quite this voluminously studied and such a refined, curated presentation of great literature from the past, together with anecdotes and wisdom of his own gained over many years of pastoral ministry. So I'm sure we'll say this in our future episodes with Pastor Chanski, but I'll say this now at the end of our first episode, that this is a set of books that you should buy for your pastor. This is at least volume 1, if not the other 2, one that you should give to anyone who's aspiring to the ministry. Not that they're going to sit down and read them all cover to cover in the next month, but it's just an invaluable resource to really dip into if you need a refresher, or to really orient yourself if you're not sure whether you're called to the ministry or not. I think volume 1, especially in that connection, is quite valuable.
Well, if you are interested in reading these, we do not have copies to give away, but we do have copies of a little book that Pastor Martin wrote called What's Wrong with Preaching Today. You can enter for a chance to win that at theologyonthego.org or placefortruth.org. And if you're able to support the ministry of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at placefortruth.org or at alliancenet.org. If you know someone who would be helped by this episode or any episodes, please pass it along to them. And if you're able to rate and review this podcast, wherever it is that you download it, that is a help to us as well. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.